Welcome, everyone. Another day, another panic in the markets. Can you guys hear me? So we have a lot going on. We see that the markets are going down hard again today. And that is definitely a little disturbing for everyone who is an investor, obviously. So let's take a look at the situation, because in times like these, we need to be smart, very smart. And we need to figure out what is signal, what is noise. Are we in a real crash and have to get the hell out? Or was our analysis from yesterday, is it still valid and correct? So let's look at Tesla. We are at, 246. I will tell you in a second why I like that. And what is happening to the greater markets? If we go into here, the big overview, what we saw is that the European markets looked pretty terrible. And what we saw is that during the day, the DAX, for example, was crashing, 4.5% down, 5% down for the stock 600, and 4.3% down for the FTSE. So this is pretty bloody. And then what's happening in the United States? Actually, a lot of recovery here. So it's very interesting. We were down a lot on the NASDAQ, but we see a pretty sharp turnaround here, which is, whoa, this is very interesting. I don't even know if there's any urgent news, but it's still a bad day. And Donald Trump put some more pressure on the Fed Chair Powell. See, this is the interesting thing about live streams in these times. We have like minute by minute news and the markets are jumping around like crazy, but we are still down a lot. I don't want to sugarcoat the situation. And I actually also got hit with some bad stuff because I was short puts, weekly puts on Tesla. It's not the worst thing, but I had to realize some losses that I don't like. But I took some action I will share in a second. So what does it all mean, right? Where do we stand? Is this really bad? Why is it escalating like this? And when we look into why the markets are down again so dramatically, after what we saw yesterday, you will remember that this happened yesterday. So we had a dramatic sell-off, one of the worst sell-offs since COVID. And now we continue. Now we are really getting into COVID territory. The fear and greed index is at 5, which is very interesting because a minute ago when I opened this, it was at 4. So a lot of things are happening here. As I predicted, I didn't predict that it drops like this again today. I said, this is phony, the sell-off. As you can imagine, I'm sticking to my conviction, even though I had to realize my little losses, but I already took action to make up for that. So the big picture is we are seeing these losses across the board. The markets get murdered, but are already doing interesting things here. And the reason for that is basically the retaliation response for now to Trump's tariffs announcements from Wednesday. Yesterday and overnight, we saw responses from China and from the European Union. And this is all about the responses because they sound scary at first look. People are scared. So what are the responses? China. What China said is, of course, this is full of China responses here. They are putting 34% tariffs on all imports from the United States. I wouldn't care about that. First of all, if you're a Tesla investor, as Soa Merritt says here, 95% of all Model 3 and Y sold in China are locally sourced. So Tesla is, again, not affected by this whole thing. But we are getting to something else very quickly. So China announces this tariff, but it's not just about that. What I said right away when you read through China's statement is that they're also threatening or already imposed other things other than tariffs. And that's where it's getting interesting and painful for the United States, but also very painful for China. They are putting restrictions, export restrictions on rare earths. Now you have to understand that rare earths in China, China has basically a monopoly on a bunch of rare earth materials which are needed all across the high-tech economy. And so this is a very nasty move, kind of an economic warfare move that goes far beyond tariffs. Now we are talking about real warfare, where you're trying to damage other economies on purpose. right? This crosses the line away from tariffs into just warfare. And I would describe the difference between these is tariffs are like not really warfare. Tariffs have, you're doing tariffs because of your own interests. You want to protect your workers. You want to onshore manufacturing. You want to generate some revenue, make some money for yourself at the expense of your trading partners. It's not a nice thing, but it's not war. War, I would define in things where you take measures that cost you money, where you hope to damage the other side more, right? It's basically shooting a missile into an enemy tank that costs you money, but the missile costs you, I don't even know what the latest missile price is. Let's say $600,000, and the tank costs 5 million. So I'm destroying a 5 million tank and spending 600,000. So in other words, war is very destructive. Now, the US already does that with NVIDIA and chip exports, right? So, it's not that it's just China, but China does now things that really hurt people. And the same actually is true with the EU. So the EU is also reacting, and a lot of you know that I'm not holding these leaders in the EU at the highest. I don't have too much respect for them. I think they're dummies mostly or completely incompetent. But von der Leyen, for example, she's not a dummy. She might be mean, a little evil, but she's not a dummy. So the EU figured out, the tariff game, they cannot do anything. They lost this game. They cannot retaliate because they're weak. And, America doesn't need their stuff. So you cannot retaliate on tariffs. But they figured out, why play fair? Why not make this also a war? And now they are considering super nasty stuff. Nasty in the sense of like really foul play, but it's war, so who knows? And they are saying, well, we can, if we are weak, but we have this consumer market that American companies, especially Max 7 and especially media and social media, think YouTube. You guys are on YouTube. Many of you are watching from Europe. YouTube, X, of course, X is in the crosshairs, but also Facebook, all these companies. Of course, the EU could just, in a war, could totally punish them. They could make them illegal. They could impose insane, sanctions on them. They could, force them to do all kinds of stupid things. Once you want to be abusive, it's very easy to hold them hostage. And the EU probably figured out, well, that's the one thing we can do that really hurts American companies. Of course, not America, but these specific American companies. And they decided to do that. So that is very, very nasty. I didn't actually think about that because it feels like crossing a lot of lines here. But I think the Europeans are a little unhinged. Whoever puts their opposition leaders in jail and whoever ignores the votes of people that just elected a new parliament in Germany, and then the politicians just ignore that effectively and keep, pushing down policy decisions with the de-elected parliament. These are all things you can't do in a normal country. But these people have no respect for anything, a civilized democracy should do. And it's very bad. So that is why the markets got so nervous. And because they realized, well, if this escalates into a full-blown war, where it's not about tariffs anymore, it's just about China and the European Union trying to just damage American companies with anything they have, then it becomes a little nasty. Obviously, in a war like that, it doesn't come free. If China does that, they cannot export rare earths. They're losing money. And there might be other retaliations coming then. And of course, the European Union, if they do that, they're basically, embargoing their own citizens and saying, well, bad luck if you're in Germany. Bad luck if you're in France or Sweden. You don't get media anymore. You don't need free speech anyway. We just shut it down. And that is, I don't know. You never know with Europe. But normally that should create problems with their own populations. Because if you're German or Swedish or French, you shouldn't sit there and see your media being shut down. So who knows? But I think the markets are nervous because this is looking very nasty. But we also saw, that is also something we saw it overnight, that Trump is now saying, a little undisciplined, because that wasn't the plan and his other people don't say that. He says he wants to negotiate and everyone should negotiate now. So I think Trump is getting a little nervous because he doesn't like to see markets crash. And, he already indicated look, guys, this is all just a negotiation. I think Trump is breaking the line a little bit and already signals, dudes, hello, let's negotiate. And you see all these breaking news now on CNBC. Trump says Vietnam is negotiating a deal. And you understand the signal. Trump is basically saying, hello, negotiate with me. And so that is why I decided this morning, I did this here at roughly 242. So here, I realized my short put losses this week. I didn't like it. It's roughly 3 or 4% loss, realized loss. But I am shifting into TSLL. So an ETF 2x leveraged on Tesla. I bought a pretty big chunk. It's a risky operation because we don't know if the markets keep panicking on Monday or not, but this is a good indication here that they don't like this anymore. The market doesn't, at some point, I think people understand this is a phony operation. And the reason people are selling, that's also very clear when you listen to the Wall Streeters, is not because they think the world is ending. They're basically selling because they don't know what's happening. So they're selling into unknown risks. They're saying, well, sure, all theories point out to reasonably good scenarios, but we just don't know what's happening, so let's sell. That's what I call a phony sell-off. COVID, for example, not a phony sell-off. If you have a pandemic, a global pandemic, and you already can sense that everyone is determined to shut down the economy, well, you have a major, major problem. You have to sell. But here, the only reason to sell is because you're not totally sure what's happening next. That's a bad reason because there's no real damage being done right now. The damage will occur if that basically gets baked in and keeps up like this for months and businesses really pull back on investments. I think that's why we want to see deals happening. And my bet would be the first bigger deals are going to happen over the weekend. And of course, the biggest of all deals will be China. Because if China and the US signal any kind of agreement where the hostility cease, right? Where there's not crazy attacks on each other economically, like rare earths and stuff. We want to see them shake hands like, oh, now we're all happy. Now we have some tariffs in place. Let's see if that happens. I think Trump really wants this at this point. The European Union will then fall in line sooner or later, but we shouldn't underestimate their nastiness potential. So this is a complicated situation. Now, in terms of the other key metrics that I pointed out yesterday, just want to make sure we don't forget what their meta plans here. When you just look at these things, right? What matters also to Trump and the team? Oil prices. I went through it yesterday. Let's see what happened today. Oh my God, they are dropping like a stone. This is gold. This is gold for the economy. So you see what happened here, 5-day. Look at this crazy thing. It dropped from 71 now to 62. That's a massive, massive 15% drop. So that is very good for the economy. We want to see energy low. There was also an OECD thing that happened, but as I said, first strategic metric, winning again today. Second is look at the dollar getting weaker. Oh, what's happening here? Interesting. Japan here, the dollar is getting stronger. Here, dollar is getting weaker. Here, dollar is getting much weak. What is happening? So here, here the dollar, euro over dollar. Here you see less euros per dollar. So this is, here the dollar gets stronger. Here the dollar gets stronger. So this is interesting. So here we see some reversals of the objectives. This is happening all very quickly. So oil is good, currency stabilized, or here the Australian dollar is dropping a lot against the dollar. So that's interesting. So we see, very interesting. And then here, that was very surprising. Look at crypto. I'm not a crypto expert, even though I have some crypto, but that's very interesting. That stuff goes up on a day like this. Normally, we had a correlation between crypto and stocks. I don't want to over-interpret this whole situation, but that's weird. That used to be what it should be, that this is basically a countermeasure to uncertainty. I mean, I like it, but I don't know exactly what that means if he should not overinterpret this. But if crypto would decouple from the markets and become a risk flight asset, that would be very good for crypto, but I don't know if I overinterpret this. And then bonds are of course the big deal, with $6 trillion having to be refinanced this year, and now we see the 10-year below 4%. So, and some people say I'm overinterpreting this, but I always said this is a strategic objective of Trump. Obviously, we're talking about $200 billion, below 4% versus 5%. The United States is going to save $200 billion in hard interest payments just because of this 1% point. And so this is a very big deal. There is no doubt that this is a very strategic objective of the administration to get this below 4%. And with the stock market crashing, they now achieved it. I don't know if they can keep it down there, but hopefully they refinance everything fast. So that's another big win. So I just point this out to make everyone understand this is not a one-dimensional game. There are many objectives here. Payrolls also came out, and they have a huge job growth. I think 220,000 instead of 140,000 expected. I don't know exactly why, but this looks pretty good. So the big takeaway for me is I think this is a phony sell-off. I said it yesterday. Today it accelerated again. I'm still saying it's phony. We see a lot of signals now that Trump wants to negotiate, that he negotiates with Vietnam. The question is, when do the big guys join these conversations, like China? When do we see some relaxation? And can we calm down the EU from doing these really stupid things that hurt US companies and would hurt citizens in the EU dramatically? Unfortunately, mostly in areas where the EU wants to hurt their citizens, free speech and platforms like this. And finally, one big chunk of news, can we see this here? Also EU, bad stuff. The European Union wants to punish X and Elon, of course, in a very targeted, nasty way. So, Alex Jones. The EU is preparing openly totalitarian action. I totally agree with Alex here, against X, and they want to basically fine Elon $1 billion for X for stupid stuff, right? Basically, they just want to crack down on Elon and do selective punishment. And that's very concerning for me in the EU. What you see is really totalitarian tendencies, jailing Le Pen, overruling German democracy, and now just picking individual companies or Elon and just coming up with phony pseudo excuses to just take money from him. This is all very scary, and I hope Europeans understand that this is absolutely Stalinist, like, bad stuff. You can't do this. You need laws. You need, courts. You can't just make up stuff and then punish people you don't like. Of course, in the EU, they always try to make it look good. Look, it was a court, it was a judge who put our opposition leader in jail. It's like, great, congratulations. So the concern here is it escalating into some kind of real war, economic war? The rhetoric in Germany, for example, from Habeck, my favorite dummy in the European Union, is like he said, oh, the Trump tariffs are equivalent to Putin's attack against Ukraine. That's how dumb people are over there. So very sad. And so what we have to avoid is that this escalates into some kind of real economic warfare, which would be an extremely immature response. And the people who would lose that war is still China and the European Union, but it would create a lot of damage like a war. So I didn't expect it to escalate this far. I still think it's not really escalating there. It's just rhetoric, because it would damage themselves so much. But we also have feckless and dumb leadership in the European Union, so we cannot exclude that. I do not think China is going to do it. I think China is posturing the same way Trump was posturing. I think they will find a solution. China is really, really hurting right now. And that's why I loaded up a little bit on my Tesla TSLAs, and let's see where it goes. I'm still a little positive here. So that's what I'm doing. If you want to take any actions, always be very cautious, right? So you have to be aware this is a risky situation because there is no guarantee that this doesn't go down more on Monday. There's no guarantee we are not escalating into more panic. There's the fear and greed still at 5. So there is some risk here, but I think the odds are back down to 4. The odds are that this can't last for too long, in my opinion. And once you see real light at the end of the tunnel, which just takes one big player to do some kind of deal, especially China, it just takes that and we are over this whole thing. So there is risk of escalation and total implosion, but I think that risk is very small because we have competent people in China and we have competent people in the United States managing this. So that's my take. Let's see if we have any comments here. What is the latest? So this is the bottom, or are we continuing down since every country in the world will react to the US tariffs for days, weeks, maybe even months? Well, good question from Carl. As I said, I think it will take time before we have deals for everyone. The question is, when do the markets see a real light at the end of the tunnel? Not just Vietnam or Israel or smaller countries, but China ideally. I think if China signals and Trump signals that they are getting to something, that they're talking and they're making progress, that will be a clear inflection point. And I think that should happen sooner than later because Trump is signaling, let's negotiate, and everyone is now really hurting, which is the point of these tariffs. This would be a perfect time for Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, says Galaxy Loop, to cut interest rates. That's what Trump said exactly. So, but, you know, unfortunately, the leverage Trump has over Powell is limited. So that doesn't mean it happens. Limit order for Tesla at 225. Well, this can definitely happen, but can also definitely maybe not happen. Let's see. Amazing how EU does not appreciate what US did. Like, are you kidding me? These people don't even appreciate what their grandfather or daddies did for themselves. Like, the leadership in the EU is a big problem. No, Tesla likely to go to sub 100. Well, good luck, Neil. Maybe you shorted stock, not investment advice. Then Paul is talking right now. That's right. I don't know is there anything new? Powell sees tariffs raising inflation, says we'll wait before. That was pretty predictable. That's why the market is jumping around and down again. So yeah, Powell, I don't expect Powell to be a big plus here because my crypto holdings, they're a little classified right now, maybe later. Then we have the hyperbole of that German leader is absurd and irresponsible. Well, he is just the economic minister, not the real leader. He's part of the Green Party. Same with Annalena Baerbock, which is the Secretary of State. The fact that these people are in these positions in Germany tells you a little bit about the European state of affairs right now. Basically, when you talk to voters of this party, of the Green Party, when you guys would see these people, they are like literally a joke. It's a children's book author. When you talk to Annalena Baerbock, who is the Secretary of State, the Marco Rubio of Germany, she talks like a 21-year-old student at a university. That's like her level. And it shows you that Europe has been asleep at the wheel, protected by the United States, that they build a culture and society that is completely lacks any kind of accountability, responsibility. There are no repercussions for anything you do. And so now it's the first time they're basically waking up and it's like daddy is home. Like Trump is their daddy. And the daddy says, what the hell happened here while I was gone? This is like you invited your friends and trashed the house. You can't leave the house anymore. Here's the key. Click. You're locked in. No one leaves the house. You're grounded. And then they're throwing a hissy fit and they're saying, you can't ground me. It's like, of course I can't. I have the key. I own the house. And so I hope that the Europeans wake up slowly and understand, oh, maybe we have to start doing things, build economies, protect our borders, maybe make sure not everyone gets murdered on the street. But as long as it's not happening, they just don't have any leverage. That is the reason why these countries have these weird leaders where they're just unhinged, right? There is no feedback loop. It's like this rat or mouse experiment. Maybe you have heard about this, where if you give the mice a lot of food and they don't have to work for it, and that you just feed the mice, they all get very fat, then they get very confused, and then they stop procreating. Hello, Europe. They stop procreating, and then they all like perish and die randomly because they lose the will to live. There's a very famous mouse experiment. Read it. I think it was in Nature or something. Same is true for humans. If they just become completely decadent and live in a cage created by the United States where you get fed little, security pills, then it looks very bad. And then you vote for the Greens, and then you have Habeck, and then he says stupid stuff, right? And that's very dangerous for the country, because now the world gets a little reshuffled. Now suddenly you have real players coming to Europe, putting pressure on it from Putin, who's not the nicest dude, and you need to like manage him, to Trump, who's also not the nicest to Europe, to China, who's definitely not the nicest. And now Europe has to grow up and do something, and they are not ready for that. The populations are different. There are smart people in Europe who vote the right way, but the leadership is still a complete disaster. That is risky for Europe in this situation, because then stupid things happen, like what Habeck said. We have Rimantis. I'm Lithuanian, and you are in EU contact fully. Do you see the assumption for crucial changes in Europe? The bureaucrat system will kill Europe. That is true, but we see a lot of resistance. I actually saw a poll today on X. I have to double check it. I don't know if it's true, but the AfD is now at 26%, 1% above the CDU. I don't know if that's true. I have to double check the poll, but that would be a revolution. I do believe that Europe has no chance of surviving unless Germany gets turned around. Because if you're a small country, right, if you're Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, even if you're Sweden, that gets a little turnaround now, which is bigger than them, but that's all not enough. You cannot free yourself from the EU. And I'm not saying you have to necessarily dismantle the entire EU, but you have to definitely completely reform it. There's only one country that can achieve that. That is Germany. That is why Germany needs to be turned around. Everything is just waiting for Germany. If Germany would turn around and had a Trumpian-style takeover, where the AfD gets in charge, maybe with a junior coalition party of the CDU, where they can discipline them a little bit and stop them from being traitors, and they would just close the borders, start doing intelligent energy policy, decrease regulations, which is, they're basically a libertarian party. They want to decrease government, and then go towards the EU and say, okay, stop that crap, dismantle the whole thing and rebuild it from scratch, so it's actually just a free economic zone, and power gets back to the states, maybe even the actual states, not just the countries. This whole thing could be turned around very quickly. I know Europe very well, right? The Europeans are extremely capable if they are not ruled by idiots or tyrants, or like now, a combination of both. If you just leave these people alone and let German engineers and businessmen do their work, same is true for Sweden and Poland, Lithuania, like if they can just do stuff, this continent would be the number one, in my opinion. But fixing that political problem requires Germany to turn around. I think that's why Elon is so excited to help, because he's smart, he understands this whole thing. And once Germany's turned around, things can happen very quickly. But this battle for Germany is tricky. Seeing what's happening in France, by the way, also seeing what's happening in the UK, I think Germany is actually in much better shape. Germany's in bad shape, but in much better shape than these countries, because Germany is so close to turning this around. But they need some more help. So let's see. They will go the way of California, Chicago, and Portland, Oregon. Hope not, but let's see. Okay, guys, I think that's it for today. Let's do one last check what's happening here with the markets. Are we going down? Keep going down? No, it's like hovering around here. I think we are bottoming out. I think there is something happening over the weekend, but I will not guarantee that. This is flatlining a little bit. Trump says Vietnam is negotiating a deal. Nike shares rise. Let's see what happens. But this is not a sustainable situation for anyone. China is hurting crazy. They need to do something. What they did to China, what Trump did to China, was clearly designed not as a permanent solution because China's just going to die. So China and the US have to come to some agreement. And I'm sure there are crazy negotiations already going on behind the scenes. So let's see what happens. I'm betting a little bit on something happening over the weekend and next week seeing some recovery. Of course, I have a certain buffer. I don't need it next week, but I think it's sooner than later. Let's see what happens. The sell-off is phony, in my opinion. I hope you enjoyed that and see you very soon. Don't panic sell. See you guys.